The question is that this House do now adjourn. Andy Burnham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and through you, can I thank Mr Speaker for giving me this opportunity to make what will be my last speech in this House.
Shame.
I make it on the subject of contaminated blood for a simple reason. Knowing what I know and what I believe to be true, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I left here without putting it on the official record. I will be honest, it is a speech made with a sense of guilt, in that I believe we are all here, all of us, collectively culpable of failing to act on evidence that is there before us if only we care to look. And by extent from that, failing thousands of our fellow citizens who are the victims of perhaps the greatest untold injustice in the history of this country. I first want to explain the genesis of this speech. Last year, the chair of the all-party group on contaminated blood, my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, who has done absolutely outstanding work on behalf of those who continue to struggle for truth and justice. She invited me to a meeting to discuss where next for the campaign. We'd had the raising of expectations, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last Parliament, a lot of goodwill on both sides of the House, a sense that people wanted to do something to help. And that continued in the early part of this Parliament, a continued sense building that something was going to be done. But following the raising of expectations, victims now feel that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down once again. Whilst not doubting the sincerity with which it was made, the government's failure to back the apology from the former Prime Minister at his last PMQs with substantial action has left people feeling in the wilderness all over again. To try and find a way forward for them, my honourable friend asked me to speak to the group about whether my experience working on the Hillsborough campaign might provide any insights that would be useful to those still campaigning today after all these years for justice for those who've suffered from contaminated blood. And when I focused on that question, I had something of a penny drop moment, and this was preparing to come and speak to my honourable friend and the group. The more I thought about it, the more the parallels between the two, between the contaminated blood scandal and Hillsborough, became clear to me. Obviously, both relate to the 1980s. Both resulted from appalling negligence by public bodies. But also, in my view, and as I will show today, both have been subject to an orchestrated campaign to prevent the truth from being told. And it is that failure to give the victims the truth that compounds the injustice and the suffering that they have experienced. Here is what I think is the crux of the problem. Contaminated blood has always been viewed through a financial prism. And that, in my view, suits the government. It keeps the victims in a position of subservience, forced to beg for scraps of help from the various funds that have been set up. And by the way, Madam Deputy Speaker, let me make clear, I'm talking about all governments here. I'm not talking about this particular government, although I am talking about this government. I am also talking about all governments. To the extent that the public know anything much about this scandal, there is a vague sense that it is an argument about money. And in my view, it's in the government's interest to keep it there. They want to keep it there. Why? Because just as with Hillsborough, if the great British public knew the real story here, there would be such a wave of support, public support, coming in behind them, that their demands for full and fair compensation simply wouldn't be able to be resisted by the government. That is the experience of Hillsborough. When the truth was told, such was the huge groundswell of popular support that there had to be action. And I believe This is why the government doesn't want the truth to be told, because it knows then it would face little place to go in answering those calls. I have brought this debate to this House tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, to try and break through that impasse. I want to refocus everybody on giving victims what they have never had, the truth. From what I know, I believe that this scandal amounts to a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. And tonight I want to present direct evidence to support that claim. There are hundreds of victims of this scandal who can point to evidence of missing pages from their medical notes. Crucial pages missing from their medical notes. Of course, the authorities have an excuse in these cases. They can always say human error. They were lost. Or when we moved offices, the box got lost, got misplaced. And as implausible as that excuse is, they can get away with it, because how can you prove otherwise? But tonight, I want to focus on a small number of specific cases which, in my view, reveal deliberate, provable acts of cover-up.
Would my right honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, and I would like to pay tribute to his outstanding work around the Hillsborough inquiry and what he achieved there, and obviously there's still more to do. And I'm so grateful on behalf of the APPG that my right honourable friend was willing to share his experiences with us in relation to contaminated blood. But I wanted to raise one specific point with my right honourable friend, which was about the right honourable, the Lord Owen's request for documents that when he was the health minister in the 1970s, he was told by officials that they had all been destroyed. And the Archer inquiry, which I'm sure my right honourable friend will make reference to, found no reason why that should have happened. And I know my right honourable friend's going to come on to talk about specific cases of documents being lost or doctored in some way. But just from what happened to a government minister and this idea of an industrial scale cover-up, does my right honourable friend think that actually what happened there with Lord Owen and what he's about to describe with the particular individuals just shows how deep-seated this cover-up goes? Yeah.
Well, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that my honourable friend has put her finger on the point, which is that with Hillsborough, when we finally got to match up documents held at a local level with those at a national level, the full picture began to emerge. And it is my contention that exactly the same would emerge here, that the direct examples of cover-up that I'm about to give relating to individual cases would then be put together with what we know about documents held at a national level, or indeed not held, which itself implies wrongdoing. It's the putting together of that picture which in the end gives people the truth and allows people to understand how this happened. And I will come on directly to that point later in my speech. I want to focus, Madam Deputy Speaker, on three cases. I highlight these cases not because they are the only ones that I have seen or been sent. I do it because I have met or spoken directly to the individuals concerned, have a high degree of confidence in the facts, and also because I believe these cases are representative of many more. So let me start with a first case. A gentleman who doesn't want to be named, who is only named as Stuart, but I do have his full details. I will.
Grateful. I think that one of the reasons why this hasn't taken off as a real campaign widely is that victims, understandably, don't want to advertise to those around them what their condition is. and I pay tribute to those who have talked to members of Parliament, even on a confidential basis, so that some of us have some ammunition.
Well, I think the right honourable gentleman is absolutely, absolutely correct. There is a stigma related to HIV, hepatitis. People don't want to openly talk about it. And there's another, although I've drawn a parallel with Hillsborough, and he was outstanding in his support for me on that, there is a major difference as well, of course, or many differences, but one very major difference, which is that with Hillsborough, the event happened on a day, and everybody was watching it, and everybody can remember where they were when the pictures came through. This was a silent scandal that affected people in all parts of the country, all walks of life, not all people from a similar place, spread about, unable to maybe organise in the same way that the Hillsborough campaigners were able to organise. And that is another reason why they haven't, in my view, been able to move things forward. And the other reason that the honourable gentleman, the right honourable gentleman gave it is true too. I'll just talk about Stuart, Madam Deputy Speaker. When he was 6 years old, he was sent to Maidstone Hospital, sent by Maidstone Hospital to Lewisham and Oxford haemophilia centres to have tests carried out to see if he had haemophilia. When he was 7, they wrote back and said that all the tests were normal and he didn't have a bleeding problem. When he was 8, Stuart attended Maidstone Hospital with a swollen knee. Nothing more, a swollen knee. Wasn't life-threatening, and he had no bleeding problem associated with it. But the hospital, Maidstone, then, with no warning to Stuart or to his parents, none at all, treated him with 12 transfusions of contaminated blood products over 3 days. And according to his medical records later, this should not have happened. Maidstone Hospital then, in 1986, unbeknownst to Stuart, wasn't told about it, carried out an HIV and a hepatitis B test on him. He was never tested for hepatitis C, even though his records show there was a test available at the time. And it was never again tested in 1989 or called back as other tests became available. Stuart has all of his medical records, except one thing is missing: the batch numbers for the contaminated blood products. He was eventually told that he had an infection for hepatitis C. Listen to this, Madam Deputy Speaker. January 2013 is when he was told that he was positive for hepatitis C. He was also told that it was then too long for him to pursue a court case, despite the fact that legal experts said what had happened to him was negligent, and Stuart firmly believes there has been a cover-up. Let me move on to a second case, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this case is of a woman called Nicola Jones. Let me read what she's written. As a female with haemophilia diagnosed in the 1970s, from the age of 9, my parents spent years trying to find out what happened to me after receiving factor VIII. This was in the 1980s. Doctors denied anything was wrong with me, referring to me as having psychological problems. They said there was nothing wrong with the treatment they gave. She says that was not unusual for haemophiliacs growing up then. It was when I was 24 in 1995, that I asked a nurse if I'd ever been tested for hepatitis C, as my mum had seen on the news about haemophiliacs being diagnosed and dying from this new strain of hepatitis, and all the signs and symptoms listed were the same as mine. The nurse laughed at me and said, "You won't have that," then came back with my medical notes and informed me that I was positive to hepatitis C from a test done in 1991, a test I knew nothing about. Like a true haemophiliac, and after spending years of searching for answers, I had suddenly found out why I had suffered health problems since childhood. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was only later, when Nicola was able to access her medical notes, that she found an entry for 1990, which she's drawn to my attention. I have it here in my hand now. So it says on the notes, discussed hepatitis C. Nicola's told me directly that never happened. It was never discussed with her in 1990. She found out for the first time in 1995. But this story actually gets quite a lot worse, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me go on to say what Nicola says. 19 years later, little did I know that I would be at a police station reporting what I believe to be a criminal act and a form of abuse on my own child, with once again doctors performing tests without consent. Another well-known practice that haemophiliacs are sadly used to. I found out in 2013 that my 9-year-old haemophiliac son had been tested for HIV and hepatitis, and no doubt a whole host of other viruses and pathogens, just like I had been when I was younger. Given my daughter has a bleeding disorder too, there is no doubt in my mind she will have been tested. I found this out third hand by chance in a letter which was from another professional asking if my son needed treatment abroad. The letter stated, this 9-year-old haemophiliac has a factor VIII level of 10% and has been tested for HIV and hepatitis, which he is negative to. She had never been told. She had never given consent for her son to be tested. She says, surely this isn't right in this day and age. In my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a criminal act. To test a child without parents' knowledge. Let me come on to the third case, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this actually, in my view, is the most troubling of them all. It relates to a gentleman called Kenneth David Bullock, Ken Bullock. Ken was a very high-ranking civil engineer who worked around the world. In his later career, he spent time advising what was then called the Overseas Development Agency. He was a haemophiliac, and sadly, Ken died in 1998. A very traumatic death, unfortunately. Let me just read from the letter that his widow, Hazel Bullock, sent to me a few weeks ago. I am so relieved to hear you are still committed to an active inquiry into the contaminated blood tragedy. Between the 15th of November 1983 and the 3rd of December 1983, my husband stopped being a haemophiliac patient who had been infected with non-A, non-B type hepatitis to being a clinical alcoholic. This accusation continued and escalated during the next 15 years, completely unknown to him. He was refused a liver transplant in 1998 and left to die still unaware of these appalling accusations. He did not drink alcohol. Mrs. Bullock has examined her late husband's medical notes in detail, Madam Deputy Speaker, and again, I have them here in my possession today. There's an entry from February 1983. On his notes, acute hepatitis, it says. And then another one from March. Non-A, non-B hepatitis, which he probably obtained from cryoprecipitate, the treatment, the recognised treatment at the time. 1983 again. In view of his exposure to blood products, a diagnosis of non-A, non-B was made. However, it would seem at that point, Madam Deputy Speaker, all mention of blood products was to be stopped very suddenly. They were never again to be found anywhere in my husband's notes, says Mrs. Bullock. From the 15th of December 1983, all the hospital records refer only to alcoholic damage to the liver. I have in my possession full copies of all the following notes. December 1983, alcohol could be considered. 1994. Likes a few beers at weekends. 1995. Alcoholic-related hepatic dysfunction. 1995 again. Clinical alcoholism. 1996. Chronic high alcohol consumption. 1998, the year that Mr. Bullock died, alcohol cirrhosis. Mrs. Bullock concludes her letter. My husband died on the 3rd of October 1998. At no time during this 15 years should alcohol have been mentioned. My husband's rare and occasional glass of wine was minimal. He never drank beer or spirits. Alcohol was never a part of our lives, and he had his last glass of wine on the 18th of June 1995, my 60th birthday. My husband died completely unaware of these accusations that have shocked family, friends and colleagues alike. Madam Deputy Speaker, just as the evidence of amended police statements provided the thread that we eventually pulled to unravel the Hillsborough cover-up, so I believe the evidence I have just provided must now become the trigger for a wider inquiry into establishing the truth about contaminated blood. There is a very disturbing echo of Hillsborough, is there not, Madam Deputy Speaker, in what I have just said? In that people who were the victims of negligence by the state were suddenly the victims of smears perpetrated by those working on behalf of public bodies, particularly smears related to alcohol, to suggest that the disease that afflicted Mr. Bullock's liver was self-inflicted. It reminds me, of course, of those front-page newspaper stories that appeared straight after Hillsborough that alleged the Liverpool fans were drunk. It's a time-honoured tactic, isn't it, to deflect the blame from where it should be over to somewhere else. Now, it is, of course, possible that in each of the cases that I have mentioned, the hospitals and clinicians concerned were acting on an individual basis to prevent their negligent practices being known. But I have to say, I doubt that this was the case. My suspicion, as I said to my honourable friend a few moments ago, is that there will be documents held at a national level, either by the government, regulatory or professional bodies, that point to a more systematic effort to suppress the truth. I've actually got two in my possession, so I can save the Minister or the government time if they suggest that there aren't any. There are some. Two documents that I want to put on the official record today, Madam Deputy Speaker. One, a letter sent from Stanford University's Medical Centre in January 1975 to the Blood Products Laboratory, then the UK government's wholly owned blood products operation. This letter goes into great length warning about the risk of the new Factor VIII products that were coming onto the market. It said, in relation to one particular product, this gentleman writing the letter, Mr. Allen, he said of one product, the source of blood is 100% from Skid Row. Skid Row derelicts, in his words. He is writing to warn the British government about the blood products that are being used. The second document is from the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, sent in January 1982 to all haemophilia centre directors in England. It is talking about the new products coming on the market. And it says this: after initial production batches may have been tested for infectivity by injecting them into chimpanzees, it is unlikely that the manufacturers will be able to guarantee this form of quality control for all future batches. It is therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings to what extent the infectivity of the various concentrates has been reduced. The most clear-cut way of doing this is by administering these concentrates to patients requiring treatment who have not been previously exposed to large pool concentrates. In other words, Madam Deputy Speaker, let's find out whether there's infectivity, in their words, in these products by using patients as guinea pigs. That is what this is saying, without regard for the consequences. Proof, in my view, of negligence of a very serious kind indeed. And that's what then brings me to the point that my honourable friend raised earlier. When we have these documents, the Americans warning in 1975 about blood products derived from blood taken off convicts on Skid Row. And then when we have a letter going out from the Haemophilia Centre in Oxford some 7 years later saying that they needed to be just push on with trials, give them to patients so we can find out if these products are infectious. My goodness, you soon imagine, don't you, that there's something that might need to be hidden here. And that is then when you consider the question of a health minister's papers, entire paper sets, as I understand, to be comprehensively destroyed under something that they called the 10-year rule. I've been a minister, I've never heard of the 10-year rule. Have you, Madam Deputy Speaker? It's a new one on me. A minister's papers destroyed without his consent seems to sound alarm bells to me and to suggest that something is seriously amiss, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Would my right honourable friend give way?
I will.
I also wondered if my right honourable friend was as shocked as I was to learn that in November 1983, the then Health Secretary told Parliament that there is no conclusive evidence that AIDS is transmitted by blood products. Yet months earlier, the department was preparing a document which said AIDS was almost certainly transmitted in this way, and the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens told also of strong circumstantial evidence that it was bloodborne. So it seems again there was real issues about what was being told to people and Parliament, and of course ministers must never mislead Parliament, and yet clearly the information that was being given to Parliament back then was not correct.
Well, I fear my honourable friend is right once again. I am aware that Crown immunity was applied to individuals to protect the government from litigation around this time. I think it does paint the picture, Madam Deputy Speaker, and you know, this is why we come on to the need to see the papers so that we can, well, let's find out. I mean, I don't want to stand here and accuse ministers in that government of anything. That's not my purpose. But I would say let's have a look at the papers. Let's at least see whether or not there was any misleading statements given. What I think we have evidence here in terms of the cases I've put before the House today is, number one, people used as guinea pigs. Number two, people given inappropriate treatment, as Stuart was. Number three, tests being done without people's knowledge or consent. Number four, the results of tests, even when they revealed positive results, being withheld for years, decades in some cases, from those individuals. And it's even been suggested to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that other people close to those people then got subsequent infections from people because they didn't know they were HIV or hepatitis C positive, were living their life, and then infected other people. And number five, as we saw in the case of Ken Bullock, the falsification of medical records, slurs, smears in a medical record to suggest liver disease was self-inflicted. These are criminal acts. Criminal acts. Yeah, I will give way to my honourable friend.
At this stage, pay tribute to him when he used to be Secretary of State for Health, because I was in the department with him at the time as a PPS. Can I ask you this question? Are we saying that the information is immune from the Data Protection Act and the Freedom of Information Act? Was that ever applied in this situation?
Well, I think people have applied for documents, but many have been withheld. And I'm going to come on to this point in a moment. I was a minister in the Department of Health just after the Archer report had come out and had been responded to by the previous Secretary of State and Minister of State. And I came in, and at the instigation of the late Paul Goggins, sought to reopen the whole issue, and received a lot of institutional resistance, if I could put it that way. And I stand here myself out of a sense of guilt. I wish I'd have done more over the years, but having looked at it all and pieced it all together, I think the documents that are withheld would fill in some of the gaps that I'm describing today. Give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, my honourable friend, for giving way, and I pay tribute to the work he's done on this issue and many others. The case he describes, or the third case he describes, surely is one of defamation. And is it not the case, and would he agree, that all families affected now, if they haven't already, must access their own medical records or the medical records of family members who've passed away?
At least defamation. I mean, misconduct in public office. I think there are a range of potential offences that could be considered here. And it remains the case that some people haven't had access to their full medical records. The number of people who've said that pages are missing, crucial pages are missing. There's just so many examples of those. Obviously, you can't prove that, but I have put on the record today things that I think are provable and are criminal, in my view. And that cannot be left there. And this is where the Minister's going to have to answer this point directly when she responds.
Well, my right honourable friend,
I certainly will.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way and pay tribute to him, and the member for Kingston upon Hull for the work they've done in exposing this. When Alex Smith, a constituent of mine, first came to an advised surgery to tell his story about how he lost his wife through contamination, now he himself had contracted hepatitis C through a contaminated blood product, I couldn't help but feel aggrieved on his behalf. It feels now, though, that this has moved on to something completely different, which is a very sinister cover-up, and I pay tribute to the work of my friend for exposing it and getting it this far.
I think it has. I mean, for me, that whole thing about finance, always about finance, can we give them a bit more? It's kind of been helpful to the government, because it's never been focusing on the issue that it really should be on. And as I said at the beginning, if the truth were known, the wave of support behind people struggling for the truth would have been massive, absolutely massive, and the government would have had nowhere to go. It would have had to respond, and consequently people are still struggling like the honourable gentleman's constituents, and hopefully they won't have to struggle for much longer. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful. It seems to me what he's pointing out are three major things. The first is that those still alive who are affected and their families need proper help, generous help, without delay. The second is to have an inquiry into what went wrong all the way through, especially if people have interfered with the preservation of evidence. Whether people are prosecuted is a separate issue, but actually knowing what happened matters most. But the point, I think, which is really in my mind, is it was in 1970 or 71 where Richard Titmuss, in his book The Gift Relationship, pointed out the difference between blood donations in Britain where they were freely given by the healthy and the point the right honourable gentleman has made about where it came from in the States. If that is there in the book in 1970 or 71, people should have paid attention as soon as they had any warning at all, whether from Stanford or anybody else.
That was the direct content of the Stanford letter. I think there was a worry that the NHS was using these products in a completely different context, not understanding the difference between the two systems. That is the Stanford letter. And I don't stand here tonight proclaiming to be an expert on all of the papers. I'm not. What I am doing here is saying what I know to be wrong from the people I've spoken to, and then linking it to those documents to say what I believe to be the case. I may not be right, but I think we need to find out whether I'm right. And that's the point that I will be putting to the government later. I certainly will give way.
I thank my real friend for giving way, and I wasn't going to intervene, but this point that was made by the right honourable member opposite about treatment being needed and generous treatment. Generous treatment is not what the victims of this NHS scandal are. I have a constituent who was infected in this scandal as a child at the Manchester Children's Hospital, and who, when he discovered that his cirrhosis meant if it remained untreated he ran a 25% chance of developing liver cancer, was also told that he would be denied treatment under the NHS, that the treatment he needed to clear the load from his system would cost £100,000, and it was at that point he decided to use his ex gratia payment that he'd been made, and is supposed to be some compensation, not enough but some compensation. He used it to try to clear the virus load out of his system. That's the situation that that people are in, victims are in at the moment, and that's the situation my constituents are in, and it is a disgrace. They should not be fighting and using their own money for their own treatment.
It's a total disgrace. You know? Absolutely full, fair compensation now. Don't delay. Do what Ireland have done. Do what other countries do. It now. Government should do that now. They raised expectations. They should do it, and we'd all support it. But I think just a will in a moment. Mrs. Bullock, who I mentioned, she's reduced to sending begging letters. She had to sell the family home, move away from everything, sending begging letters to the Skipton Fund for a stair lift. She's not well herself now. How can that be right? We're making a woman who's lost everything send begging letters for a stair lift as she tries to cope on her own because her husband is no longer there. And on the points about medical treatment, Mr. Bullock, as I understand it, possibly was refused a liver transplant because his note said he was alcoholic. I mean, it's injustice upon injustice here. It's absolutely scandalous. And I hope the House now is understanding why I couldn't live with myself, as I said at the beginning, if I left this place without telling it directly what I know to be true. Give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. He's making a very powerful case that there was a systematic cover-up. And by joining together the dots in the way that he does, there's a picture which seems to me to be emerging that needs to be examined further. But even if he's wrong, and what actually we're confronted with is systemic administrative and medical failures, the argument for immediate compensation for all those people affected is so powerful that the government do need to look at that urgently and, if possible, say something sensible about it today.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's just downright immoral to make them beg, carry on begging in the way that they've been forced to do. They raise their hopes. They should deliver on the former Prime Minister's promise and do what my right honourable friend has just said. But in terms of the story that's becoming clear, there is a story coming clear, isn't there? Warnings from the United States ignored. A wish to drive on with these new products from the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. We'll just push them out there to find out the results before we really know whether there's infectivity. Problems started to happen, and then possibly there was a kind of wish, oh God, we don't really want, the government might be exposed here to litigation. Let's not have it in the notes of people so that we don't have a story building here about how there's been negligence and people might have a compensation claim. That's the story. That's the story I've got. I don't know what anybody else thinks. And worse, actually, for some people say, well, actually, don't just destroy their notes, falsify their notes. That's the story. That's why we need to find out whether it's true or not. Because as my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are criminal acts, I come back to this point again, that didn't just happen by chance. A major injustice has happened here. And when I make this speech tonight, I think of our late great friend Paul Goggins, who I miss every single day and did so much to advance the cause of justice of those who suffered, and of course of his constituents Fred and Eleanor Bates, and the promises that I've made to them to act for them in Paul's name. In a 2013 debate like this, just before he died, Paul made an impassioned call for, quotes, a serious government-backed inquiry with access to all the remaining records and the power to get to the truth of what happened and why. His demand was as undeniable then as it is now, and yet it pains me that, in the 4 years since, this House has not moved it forward at all. If this continues to be the case after what I have said tonight, I am afraid that this Parliament will be complicit in that cover-up. In reply to my honourable friend's demand for an inquiry, a letter she wrote in October 2006, the Prime Minister said this: "The relevant documents have been published on the Department of Health and National Archives websites, and it is unlikely that a public inquiry would provide further information." In my view, that is a highly debatable statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I don't think a Prime Minister who has a good track record in helping secure justice for those to whom it has been denied should have put her name to a letter, probably drafted by the Department of Health, like that. I remember exactly the same thing being said to me by those who opposed the setting up of the Hillsborough Independent Panel. Everything's out there, it's already known. It's what they always say. If the Prime Minister is confident in her assertion, and I say this to the Minister, rather than just publishing the documents the government has selected as relevant, why not publish all of the government-held documents so that we can all decide whether her claim is true or not? On the basis of the evidence I have presented tonight, I believe it would be quite wrong for this House to resist that call. To be clear, I am not calling for a lengthy public inquiry. I am calling for a Hillsborough-style disclosure process overseen by an independent panel which can review all of the documents held by government, NHS and private bodies. And just as with Hillsborough, this panel process should be able to review documents withheld under secrecy protections, and make the necessary connections between documents held locally and nationally, and then produce a report on the extent to which the disclosure of those documents tells a new story about what has happened here. So tonight I issue a direct challenge, not just to the government actually, but to all parties in this House, including my own front bench and the SNP. It is to do the right thing and put a commitment in your election manifesto to set up this Hillsborough-style inquiry into contaminated blood. That, in my view, would be the most effective way of getting as quickly as possible to the full truth, the whole story, as it did quite effectively and efficiently with Hillsborough. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do want to be clear tonight with the Minister and the House. If the newly elected government, after the general election, fails to set up the process I describe, I will refer my dossier of cases to the police, and I will request a criminal investigation into these shameful acts of cover-up against innocent people. So I say to the Minister, the choice is yours. People are asking me already, why don't I just go straight to the police with the evidence that I have got? And I owe them an explanation as to why I am not doing that. It is my view that the individual crimes I've outlined are part of a more systematic cover-up and can only be understood as part of that. If we refer them piecemeal to the police, they may struggle to put together the bigger picture of what lies behind the falsified medical records, and that may in turn delay truth and justice. However, if the government won't act, then I believe a police investigation is the correct step, and that is what I will request, because I can't keep this information in my possession and not do something with it. And as we know, time is not on the victim's side, so I will set a deadline on it. If the government does not set up a Hillsborough-style inquiry by the time the House rises for the summer recess, then I will refer my evidence to the police and I will request that investigation.
Well, friend, give way very briefly.
We'll give way.
I thank my right friend for giving way. I think he's making an incredible, powerful case, and I know that it's his final speech that he'll make here. I should say, because we discussed it earlier, that the Shadow Health team entirely supports his call.
Well, Madam Deputy, I'm very, very pleased to hear that. I hope that means a commitment in the election manifesto of the kind that I've just called for. I give way to my friend.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that there should be a backbench business debate on this issue when Parliament returns before the summer recess, so that backbenchers from all parties can pressure the government to meet his demands?
Well, I make this plea, I won't be here, but I make this plea to him and to, I don't know if he will be returned. You know, don't rule out Labour in Scotland, we're on the way back. I say it to everybody, people who are here in this house today, people who are candidates who may be coming here, you must act on this information. You cannot leave this where it is. Your conscience tells you you've got to do something about it. Madam Deputy Speaker, when the government ruled out an inquiry into Orgreave, despite the existence of clear evidence of serious wrongdoing by the police, they did so on the basis that, quote, nobody died. I am afraid that threadbare defence will not hold here.
No.
People have died, 2,000 in all, and they have been the victims of both negligence and cover-up. In its heart of hearts, this Parliament knows that to be true, and so the question is, what are we going to do about it? I will end with a quote from an email I've received from another victim, Roger Kerman, who became infected with hepatitis C in 1978, but who only phoned out by accident when having a hip replacement operation in 1994. This is despite having raised his family in between. His brother George died from AIDS in 1991. He says this, I have been fortunate to make it as far as I have, but I have a real sense of anger against successive governments for their indifference to the plight of so many. Politicians should not be surprised at the loss of confidence in Parliament when candour is not forthcoming and they are seen as interested only in preserving their own position and the status quo. I suspect Roger speaks for every single family affected by this scandal. It has been an enormous privilege, Madam Deputy Speaker, for me to serve my constituents in Lee in this House, and it is with a real sense of sadness that I prepare to leave. But I have to say, I have also, in my 16 years here, had my eyes opened to its shortcomings. The simple fact that following Hillsborough, so many other justice campaigns have come to me, many of them from the 1970s and the 1980s. That simple fact tells me something. It tells me that this place has not been doing its job properly. Westminster will only begin to solve the political crisis we are living through when, in the face of evidence, it learns to act fearlessly and swiftly in pursuit of the truth and gives a voice to those of our fellow citizens who, through no fault of their own, have been left in the wilderness. Collectively, we have all failed the victims of contaminated blood, and I do not exempt myself from this. And I wish to apologise to all those affected for coming so late to this issue in this speech tonight. And I apologise to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the length of time I have taken in introducing my comments. But in another way, I don't actually. I don't. The House should be delayed tonight on this matter. The truth has been delayed for people. The justice has been delayed. So this House should be delayed tonight as it hears directly what they have been through. And I hope we have given a flavour of that tonight. So I say this to members here and those who may come here. It is never too late to do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think... No, not clapping. Here would be fine. As the Honourable Gentleman concludes his valedictory speech in the House, I'm sure that the whole House will join me in wishing him well. Yeah. Minister Nicola Blackwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would like to